Until he discovered her true identity, he believed she was simply another first-class gold digger. A scent of leather and wealth wafted through the first-class cabin, while low-volume chatter and the clink of champagne glasses filled the air. As the passengers got comfortable, fiddling with their luxury handbags and pricey watches, the overhead bins slid shut. As he settled into his favorite window seat, 3A, Ethan Caldwell hardly looked up from his. He had the self-assurance that comes from having closed deals and sat in boardrooms where his comments, no matter how unfunny, would always get a good chuckle. Just before flight, he ordered a scotch and undid his tie, perhaps signaling to everyone that he belonged in first class. Although the flight from Dallas to Tampa was barely 3 hours long, he was able to savor the comforts of first-class flying throughout that time. Considering the availability of expensive drinks and the chance to assess the cabin, he had no intention of working. At that moment, he beheld her. Just a few rows forward, an iPad-wielding blonde woman sat with her profile partially exposed. Something about her felt familiar, albeit not quite right. Perhaps she was a newscaster from her town, an actress from the C-list, or someone who was urgently trying to make the most of her final moments. A well-mannered traveler who was unfortunate enough to be seated next to someone who enjoyed his own voice could not help but smirk as he nudged the man in his seat. Do you ever notice how some individuals believe that money can buy class? Passengers in the vicinity may overhear Ethan musing. His seatmate, who was engrossed in the in-flight magazine, chuckled in a kind, non-committal manner. Ethan didn't require an audience to continue talking, but he wasn't interested in engaging in conversation either. "She looks familiar," he continued, nodding his head. "Perhaps a reclusive reality TV star?" "You know the one, big hair, designer purse, and utterly clueless about how to blend in." Anyone in his immediate vicinity could hear his comments as they drifted through the air. The woman, who seemed either oblivious to or uninterested in his commentary, kept her attention fixed on her iPad, albeit a few glances were directed in his direction. He found that offensive. Her kind was expected to give a hoot about the opinions of men like him. The flight attendant checked seatbelts and collected empty glasses as the plane started to taxi. Already bored with the flight before it even took off, Ethan stretched slightly and leaned back. As the blonde woman smiled and graciously relinquished her drink, he observed her with interest, her expression unruffled, her body language relaxed. He was irritated by that. She didn't seem the type of lady to be spooked by idle chatter or suspicious looks. Instead, she exuded an air of calm assurance. That, in turn, caused Ethan to increase his bet size. He moved to ensure that his voice was audible to a sufficient degree. He pondered, seemingly finding amusement in the situation, that she must have married well. This is the typical trajectory of such narratives. Perhaps the fourth spouse, cosmetic surgeons available at a moment's notice. It's never changed. At least this time the air felt different. Across the aisle, a businessman glanced at him briefly but pointedly. As she stepped aside, the flight attendant paused, just a little. As if wishing he were somewhere else, even the man seated next to him sighed softly. Naturally, Ethan failed to notice. Perhaps he was indifferent. Tapping his fingers against the glass, he reached for his scotch as the plane took off. 3 hours, more than enough time for him to occupy himself. His amusement, however, was going to be at the price of himself, which he failed to anticipate. When Ethan picked up his commentary again, the jet had hardly climbed to cruising altitude. When he felt overlooked, he was the type of man who wouldn't let things go. No sign that she had heard him or cared was made by the woman, who had scarcely looked up, if she had been there at all. He was unhappy about that, thus he drew nearer. As soon as the seatbelt indicator went off, he waved wildly at the flight attendant, making it look like he was in a bar instead of first class. He then relinquished his empty glass and requested another scotch. Then he nodded toward the blonde woman and her food, just because he was that kind of guy. "In my pocket." It was an experiment, a means of gauging response. Maybe she would play along with his light-hearted teasing by shaking her head and laughing. She enjoys showering women with affection. That was, at least, his initial assumption. However, the flight attendant showed no reaction whatsoever. She removed his drink and gracefully said, "I'm fine, sir," as she stepped away from him before he could press. Ethan shook his head in amusement. She was, therefore, typical of the type of lady who pretended to be superior to everyone else and who avoided small talk at all costs. Returning his attention to his reticent seatmate, he noticed that she had taken up a book as a means to evade him. Ethan tapped the armrest between them and asked, "You ever notice that?" He was referring to the way certain people carry themselves, as if we were mere extras in their own mini-film. A brief gaze was exchanged before the man reverted to his reading. Ethan smiled and admitted that he hadn't given it much thought. He would not budge from this. He continued, his voice maintained at the ideal level, not so loud as to be disrespectful but audible to others around him, that he would reveal her identity in detail. She's the type of lady who relies on her surname or favors to get by. She might be the ex-wife of a senator or one of those lawyers who like being on TV but has no luck in court. His intention was to gauge whether he was irritating her, so he let the remarks to linger, hoping for a change or reaction. Not a single thing. The blonde kept her cool and continued to scroll through her tablet as if he didn't exist or was unimportant. Ethan irritatedly adjusted his watch and let out a harsh breath through his nose. No longer was this enjoyable. He didn't even look, he just mumbled, "It seems the rest of us don't give a hoot about her." A woman in a navy pantsuit and her seatmate exchanged knowing looks a few rows back. On the other side of the aisle, an elderly man looked up from his newspaper with an arched eyebrow. Now that people were taking notice of him, Ethan, being arrogant as he was, thought they were rooting for him, that they thought she was as foolish as he was, and he doubled down on his stance. He drew closer, his elbow on the armrest, and his voice slightly lowered as if he were imparting profound wisdom. Take note of what he said. He smirked as he said it. Later on, she will likely write a post lamenting the monotony of travel, perhaps even bringing up the topic of manspreading. "Excuse me, sir, but I can assure you that women like her like playing the victim." The tone was steady and unruffled. Looking around, Ethan anticipated the flight attendant once more. He couldn't help but fix his gaze on the blonde woman. She had never looked directly at him before, and her expression was priceless. There was a look, a calm, measured one, that made Ethan acutely conscious of the tone he had been using in his own voice. There was no rage or annoyance. He brushed aside the niggling sensation of something strange and unsettling, which had not occurred to him in quite some time. He stared into her eyes, anticipating her next move, a reprimand, an argument, an explanation for his actions. Instead, she chose not to. She merely observed him for an instant before returning her attention to her tablet, as if he were not valuable. Additionally, Ethan experienced an unfamiliar emotion for the very first time. As a kind of self-medication for the growing pain in his chest, Ethan fiddled with his cufflink while sitting up in his chair. It wasn't dismissive, that expression on her face. Nothing had offended it. The situation was far worse. She seemed to have seen 100 men like him before, and she had already determined he wasn't worth her time. He might have easily shrugged, rolled his eyes, and returned to his scotch because of that. Still, it wasn't the case. Rather, it irritated him. Nodding courteously, the flight attendant brought back his drink and placed it on the table before gracefully slipping past him. She showed no signs of warmth, small conversation, or prolonged attention, which he found odd. Did she also hear him? He looked back at the woman before taking a long drink, listening to the ice crackle in the glass. Pam, he told himself. Even though he had no idea who she was, the mere mention of her name piqued his interest. Unfazed, she continued reading. However, an unseen boundary was established between them now that she had recognized him once. The daring is silent. When it came to dares, Ethan was terrible. His voice was just low enough to be casual, yet high enough that those surrounding them could still make out a few words of his words when he spoke straight to her. "Is it Pam? You appear to be nothing like a Pam." Her silence betrayed her. His stomach churned slightly, but he persisted. "No offense taken," he continued. "It's just that I'm confused. To me you resemble Kelly, or Lauren, more." Shaking his head, he let out a laugh. "Pam reminds me like a mother. The same old story." Once again Ethan changed. She was no longer only ignoring him. She was standing by while he humiliated himself. The older guy across the room had returned to his work, but Ethan had noticed his critical glare as he had raised his eyes to look at him before. Ethan could tell that the younger man in the suit 2 rows ahead was playing a practical joke by appearing to type on his laptop. His attention was fixed on what was being said. He was being watched, even by the flight attendant who had just passed by with a tray. Ethan felt his gut knot at the realization. He couldn't have gotten them to laugh. Seated again, he drew his breath out through his nostrils. "Of course, I'll just let them make that decision." Nowadays, everyone was so tight-lipped. Trying to pass off some harmless banter as an attack on one's person, nothing he said was really hurtful. As if the cosmos had been patiently waiting for the right moment, the flight attendant broke the glass after he had emptied his last drop of scotch. "Would you like another drink, Miss Bondi?" And initially, Ethan had trouble making out the words. Pam, the blonde woman, looked up and graciously declined before his intellect caught up with her. "Hi, Bondi." "Bondi, Pam?" With a little curl of his fingers on the armrest, he tightened his entire body. It was crystal clear now. Known across the nation with political clout, this former Florida Attorney General was a legal bulldog who had faced off against some of the nation's most prominent figures. A lady who, my goodness, wasn't famous only for her TV appearances. She was the type of lady who could destroy someone's life with just one phone call, which is why she had appeared on television. Ethan felt a parched throat. She wasn't staring at him, so he snuck another glance. That wasn't necessary. It was news to her. Now he did as well. At this point in the journey, Ethan found himself speechless. With his thoughts racing as if trying to find a way out, Ethan forced himself to swallow. Bondi, Pam. As he thought about the name, he felt his self-assurance slipping away a little bit with each syllable. He clamped his fists down on the armrest. How was it that he had failed to see her sooner? Naturally, he had seen her on television before, in trial footage that had played on all the major networks, at press conferences, and on news broadcasts. She had triumphed over politicians and corporations alike. He sat down a few feet from her and suddenly realized that his condescending, barely audible comments had left him in the worst conceivable spot. He looked like he was bleeding to death. Suddenly acutely aware of the sheer number of individuals within earshot, he cast an anxious glance around the cabin. 3 people. The flight attendant who had overheard everything, the businessman across the aisle who was tapping away at his laptop, and the elderly man. Was he serious when he publicly ridiculed a former attorney general in front of a whole first-class cabin? Ethan shifted uneasily in his chair as he cleared his throat. The situation needed his immediate attention. He tilted his head ever so slightly in her direction, forcing a grin that was almost painfully fake. In an effort to hide his genuine amusement, he managed to elicit a small laugh. It occurred to me that I was surrounded by Florida's most esteemed citizens. Pam remained silent. None of her movements budged. She remained silent. As if he weren't there, she persisted in reading on her iPad. Discomfort gripped Ethan's belly. Every syllable had been heard by her. She had taken note of each remark. She had already made up her mind that he wasn't worth her time. She would have been better off not naming him out than that. A lot worse. She had spun around and returned fire. Even so, he had the opportunity to argue. May have been able to play it off. I use that as a punchline. However, it was intentional. It was her decision. Ignoring him as he sinks into his own shame, while he frantically sought to come up with a word, any word. To ease the tension, Ethan pretended to adjust his seatbelt once more. He made an effort, maintaining a light tone, and I followed a few of your cases when I was younger. Your career has been great. Not a single thing. Not even a glance. Missing response. A tingle went up Ethan's back. As he rubbed his jaw and let out a long breath, he became acutely aware of how much longer the flight had to be. Experiencing shame for a brief moment was one thing. Sitting in the stress he had generated while stranded at 3,500 feet was an entirely different ballgame. The flight attendant came back right when he felt things couldn't get worse. "Hey, would you like another drink too?" she inquired. Ethan hesitated before opening his mouth to speak. The thought of another scotch didn't feel right with him for some reason. "Simply water," he murmured. Taking his empty glass, the flight attendant gave him a knowing nod. He became aware of it at that moment. Pam Bondi's eyes betrayed the slightest hint of amusement. Her head remained fixed. Did not speak. However, in that brief instant, he understood. She had been observing. Everyone was waiting for her. She seemed to be relishing in his misery at the moment. After a lengthy period of not experiencing it, Ethan Caldwell finally knew what it was like to be little. With his own words crushing him like an anvil, Ethan sat stiffly in his chair. How could he have allowed this to transpire? On the whole, he had a talent for reading people, steering conversations in his favor, and avoiding embarrassing himself. Still, he found himself ensnared in his haughtiness as he stared at the back of the head of the lady who had silently destroyed him. A plan to get out of there was racing through his head. Does he need to say sorry? Tell a joke? Ignore the whole thing? He stealthily assessed the situation by looking over at the other travelers. Across the aisle, the businessman had stopped staring at him. However, Ethan could tell he had been observing due to the little grin on his face. The flight attendant maintained a more level head and gave him an impartial look as she placed his water tray down. Ethan choked and coughed. "Yours faithfully." With a nod, she continued. And that was even worse in a way. She had no sympathy for him. Nothing bothered her. We didn't care about him because he wasn't important. He turned back to Pam, who continued reading as if nothing had happened. She seemed to have moved on and was caring for herself as though nothing had happened. Perhaps it is the reason why it was so painful. Nor was she furious. No apology was going to sway her. His worthlessness had been determined by her. It was all Ethan's fault that he despised that sensation. His fidgety, nervous fingers drummed restlessly on the tray table. He recalled the accounts he had read about her, including her high-profile cases, her legal struggles, and the individuals who had attempted to intimidate her but were unsuccessful. It was his naivete to believe that she would value his viewpoint. Ethan let out a long breath. Perhaps the elevation had a role. Perhaps it was because he was stuck with nowhere to go. Thoughts concerning his character emerged for the first time in a while. For a long time he assumed that his version of events was the sole valid one, strode into rooms as if he were the only one there, and spoke as if his opinions meant more than anybody else's. However, he was not the dominant figure at this same moment. He was not in a position of authority. Plus, the sensation was unpleasant to him. Encircling him, the plane emitted a gentle hum. Discordant murmurs and the infrequent clinking of glasses filled the cabin. As he stared vacantly at the chair before him, Ethan took a sip of his water. Perhaps this was the type of lesson that individuals like him didn't realize they needed until they were compelled to. Perhaps this was just what he had been waiting for. The seemingly limitless expanse of sky beyond the wing captivated Ethan as he gazed out the window. He felt tiny and insignificant all of a sudden due to its enormity. That was an unfamiliar sensation, and he wasn't sure he enjoyed it. For a long time he had acted as if he were everything. Even when his quips weren't hilarious, people still laughed at him. Even when he didn't have anything worthwhile to say, they still nodded along. Standing tall and proud was nothing new for him. However, something he had long since forgotten was brought to his attention today. No amount of money could buy respect. Power was not the issue. It has nothing to do with having the most resounding opinion. The focus was on personality. Since she was under no obligation to do so, Pam Bondi had taken no action to humiliate him. She had deferred to his haughtiness instead. The coolness of the water settling in Ethan's throat prompted him to take another sip. Possibly for the best it wasn't scotch. It was time for him to sit quietly with his thoughts, free from the numbing effects of drink. He stole another look at her, this time half expecting her to turn around and give him a satisfied look. Instead, she chose not to. She had had enough of him. As soon as she discovered his character, she ended their relationship. A knot knotted in his chest was that knowledge. Not often did he, a person like him, have to sit in the awkwardness of knowing he had been the room's idiot. With a sigh, Ethan rubbed his temple. Perhaps it was about time he learned to listen instead of talking. Perhaps he should have paused to consider the possibility that he might be mistaken about something. When the flight attendant went by again, Ethan finally stopped waving at her to get more drink. He chose to sit silently and gaze at the sky instead. He had a revelation as the jet started to circle Tampa. Pam Bondi was unrelated to this. This spoke to the type of man he aspired to become going forward. When do we ever make snap judgments about someone without getting to know them? In our haughtiness, how often have we failed to see things as they really are? Perhaps prestige and power aren't the true lessons here. Perhaps it's about treating others with dignity before we come to regret it. Please subscribe if you found this story thought-provoking. What the heck? Hopefully you'll be more self-aware the next time around and avoid repeating that error.